Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, my name is Rory, and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel, which is a place for narrative. And what we do here on Tuesday nights is we read old folklore and fairy tales. In this case, German folklore that was only very recently translated by the incomparable Jürgen Hubert, who I will talk about a little bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about this character from this character of Pumphut. But that's actually not the only character we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be talking about a few new stories he just translated about Faust, Dr. Faust, which is one of my more popular streams. I did another episode on Faust before. I probably should have therefore put this in the advertising too, but I don't know, it was getting cluttered, so I decided to focus on Pumphut. Who also I realized I checked the pronunciation on everything but his name, so I guess we're going with Pumphut. I hope that's close to his actual German pronunciation. That was an oversight on my part. Anyways, if you are watching this live, there is a live chat right to the side here, which has the most wonderful little bunch of potatoes you'll ever find in the garden, who come and discuss the weird stories we read about folklore and so on. However, if you're not watching this live, you do have an advantage, one you may have already taken advantage of, which is down in the description below. There will be timestamps for the stories that we're reading today, so you can jump ahead to whatever section interests you. So we will, well, I won't waste any time. We'll sort of get into it. I'll do a little bit of an introduction on the concepts at play here, what they are and what they aren't, and then we'll get to the stories. We actually have a fair bit of story to get through today. Sorry, I got a little bit of a catch in my throat. Give me a second. Okay, so let's just say a brief bit on famous people in folklore. So this doesn't come up too often. I think Faust is probably one of the more famous examples, but so is St. Patrick and arguably O'Shaun in Irish folklore. And you see it, I mean, to some extent you see this with like maybe Robin Hood, but I think Robin Hood is generally agreed to be a work of fiction. But what it basically is people that probably lived, that we either know lived or someone of that name lived in the areas that they're talking about. But for one reason or another, they attract a lot of tales, legends, usually not complimentary ones, and that will be the case with these things. And these singular famous characters are really fascinating. I think Dr. Faust is one of the most interesting, because Faust, there was definitely a Faust, but what Faust comes to represent in folklore is a fear of the learned, which probably isn't a very foreign concept to modern people, especially in this day and age, but it takes a bit of a different form. So what we'll see with Dr. Faust is that when a person like goes to university and has all these knowledge, it gets perceived like mystical secrets of the special tome, which sounds funny to us, but I guess makes sense. If you really have never seen the inside of a classroom, you never quite know what they're learning. And there is a distrust that comes with that usually gets bundled in with paranoia that they've taken league with the devil. And in the case of Dr. Faust, despite the Faustian bargain of Goethe's renditions of him, he's a character that predates that. He definitely is a character who is always seen to take devil's deals, who has always sold his soul to the devil. But what really defines him is he was a learned man, and he has magic powers of some sort. And it really varies, depending on region and tale and whatever else, what exactly the extent of those magical powers are. But he becomes this magical, iconic figure that is sometimes a moral figure in the sense that he enforces a morality. He's sometimes a moral figure in that he is a cautionary tale, which is more often what we'll see. And sometimes just sort of bewilderment and amazement of the weird things he supposedly did. With Faust, we know he's a real person. With Pumphut, what we have in Pumphut is another like singular character, but exactly his nature is a little more mysterious. He isn't really presented to be a real person the way Faust is, but he is presented to be like a singular character, probably something fey, however that gets defined. But he is a and I'm going to rely on Jürgen Hubert's words here because it concerns a subculture I don't know enough about to be rambling on about, which is the Sorbian people, which are let's hope I don't forget this, West Slavic subculture that took up residence in areas of Germany and throughout, or perhaps that was their native lands. This is why I don't want to ramble. They are people that have faced persecution, as many subcultures do. Both for their language, which is a distinct language group as I understand it, and their own cultural elements. But one of their most significant cultural elements is Pumphut. Pumphut, and I'm going to read Jürgen's words here, is a Sorbian culture hero and trickster figure from the Lusatia. He is named for his pointed hat, which resembles the hats traditionally worn by pump builders. His actual day job is that of a miller's journeyman, which we'll see a lot. He seems to really concern like fair labor practices. Maybe other people will disagree, but that was the theme I got. However, he has somehow learned potent magical abilities, which he primarily uses to prank bad employers among the millers. What is unclear to me from reading these tales is whether Pumphut is presented to be something not human, and therefore that's why his magic powers, or definitely human but otherwise possessing of magic power. And I kind of actually lean towards the second version of it, but we'll see what other people think of it, because we're going to read the original collected texts. The source that we're going to read from is taken from a mixture, and Jürgen felt need to point it out, and the original collector that he's translating from felt need to point it out, so I'll point it out. Some of these come from people that were Sorbian speakers, and some of these come from people who were Sorbian, kept the cultural traditions of Sorbian, but were German speakers. And he distinguishes the two cultural groups in here, so we'll see a little break in there, and I just wanted to give you context onto why it was there. So exactly what he is, whether he's just a trickster labor rights person or not, he does represent a singular character who also is supposedly has magical abilities and is sometimes a sort of cautionary tale, because magic almost is always seen as coming from League of the Devil, just like with Faust, and so on. So I won't say much more than that, other than to sort of show you the connection I had when I was reading these tales, which are fresh off the presses from Jürgen Hubert, who runs Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, which is a Patreon that you should be supporting because it is an excellent set of work. And what Jürgen Hubert does, he does not fund me, by the way. I just really appreciate what he does. Jürgen Hubert is a translator of German folklore, of which there are massive collections of, but most of it has never been in English before. The stuff that you tend to know in German folklore tends to come from the Grimm brothers, but only their very specific collections that they sort of hampered together that are mainly focused around kind of cautionary tales for children and stuff like that. They actually did a lot more collecting than that. Folklore takes a much broader perspective than the Grimm brothers' sort of most famous tales. Not to say they're not folklore, they obviously are. And so those various collections from various German collectors of what they would have called, the peasantry folklore, are what Jürgen Hubert is translating. And these are stories that were translated this month on his Patreon for his collection, and that's why I say they're fresh off the presses. Now I'm just going to say hello to the chat, and then we'll get to the stories. I see Zombie Wolf, Tammy, Jum Store, GS, and Uncle Kitty have all shown up. Thank you very much for watching, of course, folks. Just as a note here, we're coming up on our, I think it's 3rd anniversary of this channel, which also coincides with my birthday. So my actual birthday will be on a Monday next week, so we won't be able to do anything on my birthday, but seeing as Fireside Fairytales doesn't flex very much in its formats, I'll probably do something celebrating 3 years of the channel on Thursday with our varietal show. I don't know what it's going to be. Don't get your hopes up. It's not going to be wild, but it sort of doubles as a mine and my channel's birthday. Zombie Wolf says, I love the Faust tale, particularly the pessimistic ending. There are actually alternative endings to that, by the way. There are some where he's redeemed, but most of the time, no. Tammy says, happy early birthday. Thank you, Tammy. And they're talking about films that I won't get into right now. Okay. Again, if you want to join in the chat, lots of good discussion goes on there. Okay, let me get some water. Let me get a little atmosphere, and we're going to go into just a straight, I think it's about a dozen tales about Pumphut, the Sorbian culture hero. You know, I was setting up the stream, and I was like, oh, did I leave something on for the stream or something like that? Because I can hear all these birds singing, and then I just realized it's just spring is here, and outside my window a bunch of birds were singing. I should just mic that. Okay. Our first set of tales tonight, and they are a bunch of little short tales we'll read in succession, is called Pumphut. And it comes from the collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which is translated by Jürgen Hubert, who has a Patreon to support his efforts translating previously untranslated German folklore. And I will put the link to that down in the description below, because it is good work. So let me tell you the tales I know of Pumphut, the Sorbian cultural hero and trickster. Pumphut was a miller and a carpenter, once entered the employment of a miller as a journeyman. But he was treated so badly by the miller that he decided to do him harm. Thus he used his magic so that a millstone which the miller had commissioned for his mill was too short by 3 feet. Don't make a Pumphut upset. Once Pumphut walked back and forth in front of a mill, and the miller finally noticed him and asked him what he wanted. Then Pumphut asked him for work, but the miller refused him and laughed at him in a silly hat. Well, Pumphut grew angry over this and walked away, but he had not been gone long when the journeyman approached the master and told him that the shaft of the mill had suddenly shrunk, and he was unable to mill anymore. Immediately, the miller suspected a prank from Pumphut and ordered the journeyman to run after him and ask him to come back. And the journeyman did so, and Pumphut returned. Then the master asked him to undo the damage which he had caused. Pumphut finally let himself be talked into doing so, took an axe and struck it against the shaft. Immediately, it had the same length as before. Once Pumphut met with a forester and used his magic to cause a lot of hares to jump around the forester. No matter how often the forester aimed and shot at the hares, he never hit one of them. And then he realized Pumphut had played this prank on him, but the forester was also versed in the magical arts, and thus he repaid Pumphut in the same manner. For when Pumphut had returned to his mill and wanted to grind flour, it occurred that a huge number of squirrels poured out of the opening of the millstones instead of flour. Once, Pumphut was fishing at a lake, but it was prohibited to catch fish there. Doesn't say why, but I wonder if it's one of the king's lakes. When the people in the next village noticed his activities, they forbade him to do so. And when he did not listen to the prohibition, the farmers wanted to capture him. However, when the farmers approached him, he walked across the water as if he was on firm land. And as soon as he reached the other side of the lake in this manner, he started to fish anew. Then the farmers became angry and decided to shoot him down. They fetched one of their best marksmen, and he had to load his rifle, aim it at Pumphut, and shoot. But as soon as the bullet flew, Pumphut merely lifted his leg, and the bullet passed beneath it. Well, then the farmers believed that lead would be unable to harm him, and thus wanted to try it with a silver bullet. This was done, but this bullet was likewise unable to harm him, for Pumphut caught it with his hat. Then he mocked the farmers and shouted, "Go on, shoot some more, for I could use these things." Now the farmers saw that they would be unable to harm Pumphut. Thus they invited him to visit them, and Pumphut indeed accepted his invitation. The farmers now gave him a lot to eat and asked him to teach them his tricks as well, but he did not do so, ate until he was satiated, and then moved on. In truth, Pumphut is a large nixie, which is a thing we have discussed before. As it says here, they are water spirits, generally not nice ones. And this, I think, presents the first sort of complexity around Pumphut of whether he's just a human who has magic or whether he's a fae of some sort. In this one, they more explicitly identify him as being kind of fae. In truth, Pumphut is a large nixie. However, he does not like to live in the water and mostly stays on land. Pumphut was the greatest of all mages. There's another translation of him, isn't it? It is because of him that the humans have become as depraved as they are. And I think my favorite thing about this snippet is it does nothing to explain why. What do you think it is that Pumphut did to make you depraved out there in chat? Pumphut threw a hatchet at the tower of Makrana, where it is still visible. He then spoke, "The hatchet will remain up there as long as I live, and I'm called Pumphut." And then this is where the stories come from the German-speaking Sorbs rather than the Sorbian-speaking Sorbs, I suppose. Once, Pumphut was wandering around as a journeyman when he came across the owner of a water mill. The miller was currently busy with having a new shaft crafted in order to replace a damaged one. He was very upset that the journeyman was merely idly watching, and when the latter asked for food for the trail, the miller refused him. Pumphut then proceeded on his way, and a short time later the craftsman wanted to install the shaft, but now it seemed that the shaft was too short, even though they had taken precise measurements before. Then the miller realized that there must have been something unusual about the wandering journeyman. He must surely have been Pumphut. He thus quickly ran after him and took a lot of money and food and drink with him. And soon after he met Pumphut, who was sleeping beneath a tree. He woke him and gave him something to eat and a strong schnapps and asked him to come to the facility. Then he would give him money, as well as much food and drink as he wanted. Pumphut agreed to the request and followed the miller, and when he saw the too short shaft, he called upon 4 men to pull on one end. He pulled on the other, and soon the shaft stretched to the desired length. Then Pumphut ate with relish, took the money, and went on his way. For this reason, when a shaft is too short, it is customary to say, even today, "If only Pumphut was here, then everything would be well." I could think of applications for that. Once, Pumphut worked in the mill as a journeyman. Then the millstones needed to be polished. He started with this work, and it was very cold. He complained that he was freezing during his labors, and the miller grew angry over these words, had a row with him. Quickly he put the handle of his hoe through the hole of the millstone, loaded it on his shoulder, and walked into the main chamber as if he was carrying brushwood. Then he made himself comfortable behind the oven and polished the stone, but then he left it there and went into the pub. The miller now realized who he was dealing with, and because he was unable to carry the millstone back to its proper place, he had to go to the journeyman and ask him to put the stone back in, please. Well, Pumphut agreed to the request and carried the stone back as if it was made out of wood, and then he asked for his wages and moved on. Tell me Pumphut shouldn't be the face of a union or something. I mean, come on. It's all there. In early times, Pumphut used to wander around as a poor miller's journeyman, and sometimes with a companion and sometimes without one, and he stayed wherever he found work, but it was important to be a good employer, and he did not reject either money or good food. In this manner he visited the owner of a windmill during the summer while not even the slightest breeze was moving. And the miller had a lot of grain lying around, but he could not grind because there was no wind. Remember, when they talk about mills, they're talking about like windmills. I think most of my audience knows this, but if you don't know, windmills are called such because they use the wind to turn a mill that mills things. If you didn't know, I might have blown your mind, but I think most of people know this. That's why the wind matters here. Pumphut offered to stay with him as a journeyman. The miller then indeed left the mill in his care. During the night, Pumphut made a strong wind blow, and it started to mill so that there was only a single sack of grain left the next morning. And the miller was very pleased with that, and he provided him with a generous meal and willingly gave him the wage he had earned. Then Pumphut was content and moved on. Once again, when Pumphut was in Magdeburg, the locals were arguing about who the strongest man in the village was. Took me a moment there. Those who had the most confidence in themselves bragged about their strength. In order to show off their power, they threw an axe at a target. Finally, Pumphut took the axe as well and swung it back and forth as if it was light as a feather, and finally threw it between his legs, high up in the air, so that it got stuck in the church tower. And it can still be seen there today. Even though his life was great, because he was so terribly strong and knew a lot of things, his death was terrible indeed. This is our last Pumphut tale. Once he traveled through the country with a miller's journeyman, and when they passed by a certain tree, a large, powerful snake rushed down from it directly towards Pumphut. He was unable to save himself. It was horrible to watch how Pumphut wrestled with the snake, and then one head after another grew out of the snake's neck until they were around 100. It was then, finally, Pumphut was devoured alive by the snake's 100 heads. Jess says, no, Pumphut can't die. Supposedly he did. Which I think lends to the idea that he's not a spirit. Like, is he a spirit? GS says Pumphut is a shape stretcher. That's true. Yeah. GS also says it's thundering hail there. Man, it's spring. It's not supposed to be thundering hail. So, like, what exactly is Pumphut? I don't know. I think what that is fascinating to me about these folklore collections is that I think a lot of us anticipate, I mean, I talk about this so often, my regulars are probably bored of it, but if you're not, there's a lot of want for folklore to follow sort of the rules of fantasy literature now, where everything is very clearly defined and taxonomic, but folklore doesn't really do that. And so you have a character like Pumphut, a single character, not even a single type of character, a single character in a single subculture. And even within that subcultures, you don't get much agreement as to whether it's a human mage, a human with some sort of deal with the devil where they got infernal powers somehow, or they're a nixie or a water spirit or whatever. It's like there's no real agreement about what they are. Because as much as we want to think of it as like, we've talked about this before with the idea of like a drake is a dragon without, 4 legs, or, there's various versions I've heard of them defined. That kind of thing is a very modern thing. And it doesn't really find much support. They would give 6 names to 60 different things that just shifted around. And I think Pumphut, even being a single individual, we see a lot of different conceptions of him, and that's good. That is the result of a cultural imagination. We do not need to narrow it, right? And so with that in mind, Dr. Faust, who is a person that we know existed, became the origin of a bunch of conflicting tales about what his life was, how it ended, and what he did. And we read some of those in a video I did last year called What is a Faustian Bargain? Almost around this time last year. So it's almost been a full year since I did it. Sorry, my brain etch-a-sketched on me. But Faust is another example of that in a different direction. We'll still see the same themes we saw with Pumphut in the sense that it's ill-defined exactly, although it's pretty agreed that he's a human. But, he has these magical abilities, but where they're coming from, it's generally agreed to be the devil, but we'll see some contrary opinions about exactly how he developed his powers and what his powers are and whatnot. And that's the buzzing, humming chaos of unrestrained and unmanaged imagination on a cultural level. Uncle Kitty says Pumphut is an odd duck. It is an odd duck. I think what's interesting, though, is that he really speaks to probably the priorities of the people who created him, which was fair wages, fair work, and, somebody who would get back at the bad bosses they had. Okay. We're now going to read a series of tales about Dr. Faust, which details even more apparent accomplishments and magic tricks that he performed. Some are short, some are longer, some describe his college days and so on, which he was known, as I mentioned before, there was a paranoia about education and its connection to the devil and magic. I don't know, I just like the Faust tales. So here are a few tales about Faust. So the first tale that we're going to read on Dr. Faust, another iconic character of German folklore, is Dr. Faust in Magdeburg. Once Johannes Faust of, I can get this, Knittlingen? I apologize to the people of Germany. Sat in a tavern in Magdeburg and drank and cheered the other people there. as is the custom of the Saxons and other Germans. And when the publican's boy filled up his cup or pitcher too much, so like a servant basically, Faust berated him and threatened to eat him if he did that again. But then the boy mocked him and spoke, "Sure, eat me." And then he filled up the pitcher to the brim again. Now Faust opened his mouth widely, dislocating his jaw and stretching it wide, and ate the boy in one gulp, then took the bucket with the cooling water and shouted, "After a good bite, a good drink is a necessity," and then he emptied the entire container. Now the publican had a stern talk with his guest, and told him that he had to get his servant back, otherwise he would see what the publican would do with him. Then Faust placated him and made him look behind the oven, and the boy was lying there, though he was doused in water all over and was trembling from fright. This is definitely the more spectacular of the Faustian tales. I don't remember this one in Goethe's tale where he swallowed a waiter. What a Karen. Okay. Maybe Jump Story, maybe. All right. Our next tale is called Dr. Faust in Erfurt. And it also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, who you can support in the linked comment pinned below. As the popular book of the German magus Dr. Faust proclaims, and as other sources verify, this famous and equally infamous man once lived in Erfurt for a time. He lived in Michelgasse, next to the Collegium, and lectured on Greek poets in the large lecture hall in the Collegium building with permission of the academic senate. In particular, he explained Homer to his audience, the students, and described the heroic figures of the immortal poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey so vividly that the desire arose to see them with their own eyes. And as he was a master of magic, an art which should not be thought of as simple sleight of hand, but which was taught as the so-called dark philosophy at the academies of Krakow, Warsaw, Prague, Padua, Bologna, and Salamanca, as well as at German universities. This was easily possible for Faust, who was well versed in all the arts of physics known at the time. He thus put the shadow images of the Greek heroes before the eyes of the audience, and finally he made the abominable giant Polypheum appear. If you don't know, that's basically a cyclops. And his massive apparition made the entire auditorium shake. Faust fraternized frequently with students from noble families who had money, and provided many entertainments for their and the masses' enjoyment. He once drove a hay wagon pulled by 2 horses through the most narrow alley of Erfurt, which was of a type which can otherwise only be seen in Venice today. That's narrow. Because of this incident, the alley received the name Dr. Faust's Alley for all eternity. Once Faust came riding in on a horse which continued to eat and could not be satiated. Another time he drew all kinds of wine from a wooden table, or made illusions of grapes appear before the drunk drinking companions, which they wanted to cut off. But when Faust let the illusion vanish, one of them had someone else's nose in their fingers instead of grape. One house in Schlossergasse alley supposedly still has an opening in the roof which can never be closed by bricks, because Dr. Faust created it during his coat rides. I'll give you the note on that. A supernatural journey with a magical coat usually associated with practitioners of the black arts. Like a magical carpet, basically. He is said to have created a splendid conservatory which included the exquisite catering for numerous noble guests, and thus developed a noteworthy reputation, but such arts caused more than a little mistrust. People sensed a certain infernal smell of sulfur around the magus. And a learned monk, one Dr. Klinger, was sent to him in order to talk to him, and finally enraged him so much that he said, "If the devil keeps his word to you, then you must keep your word to the devil." Then Dr. Klinger cursed Faust and convinced both the city and the university councils to banish this dangerous man. And since then, Erfurt has never again given hospitality to a master of the black arts. Gonna drink some water and we'll carry on with Dr. Faust. Something I find interesting about Faust, as a contrast here, is Faust is seen as like the upper class. Really like the decadence and deviance of the upper class. Like, keeping in mind these tales are largely written by what they would have called peasantry, right? Working class folk, I think, in a more modern sense. And it's about their sort of suspicion of university folk, and they are magic users and stuff. Whereas Pumphut is similar in many ways, but distinctly working class, right? He's a peasant in the sense he works at mills, journeyman, and he uses his magic, and it is implied to be infernal, but it's still, he's seen a little more friendly, in a little more friendly way. And I think that tells you who's telling these tales. Dr. Faust in Melanchton in Wittenberg. It is a mistake to claim, as it was already done in the middle of the 16th century, that Dr. Faust had been educated in Wittenberg and been made into a doctor of theology there. It is further claimed that he had a house and garden in the Schlossergasse alley, which never existed, and that in the village of Rimlich, which lies half a mile away from Wittenberg, he had been strangled by the devil in the presence of many magisters, graduates, and students. But he had indeed stayed in Wittenberg, and he had been tolerated there for a time until he caused too much of a disturbance. Then the authorities wanted to imprison him, but he hurriedly took his leave. And once he visited Philippe Melanchton. The latter read him the riot act, berated and admonished them that he should cease his evil deeds as soon as possible, for otherwise he would come to a bad end, which indeed eventually happened. But Dr. Faust did not care for these words. Then it was around 10 o'clock, when Herr Philippius walked down from his study chamber to the meal table, and Faust accompanied him after having been berated so heavily. Then Faust spoke to him. Philippius, you have berated me harshly all this time. Thus, I shall make it so that when you go to the meal table, All the pots in the kitchen will fly out of the chimney so that you will be unable to eat with your guests." Then Philippius answered, "You shall not do so, for I," and this is a first, it's censored in the original, it's censored in the collected text, and therefore that's what Jürgen is translating, therefore it's censored here. But in the original collected text, this is what it says, and this is what the footnote says. "You shall not do so, for I shit on your art." And then he refrained from doing so. Another old God-fearing man also admonished him that he should repent. And in response, he sent a devil into his bedroom. And when he went to sleep, in order to frighten him, the devil then roamed round the chamber and grunted like a sow. But the man was not fazed, for he was firm in his faith and mocked the spirit. "Oh, what a fine singing voice does an angel have who was not allowed to stay in heaven, and because he wanted to be equal to God was banished for it, now roams people's house as a sow." Well, then the spirit returned home to Faust and complained to him how he'd been received and dismissed, and he did not want to remain where he'd been turned away and mocked. But Dr. Faust, and I do not understand this translation, doesn't seem to come up again either. But Dr. Faust was also seduced a student. Now, I genuinely don't know if they're saying seduced or brought a student into his black arts. You decide. Dr. Lerkheimer himself, someone in his old age who had a twisted mouth. If he wanted to have a hare, he went out into the forest and performed his hocus pocus, and the hare ran into his arms by himself. Now, I'm assuming what they're saying here is that Lerkheimer is the student he seduced into the black arts, and therefore had the same sort of skills as Faust. But there is another version of that interpretation. All right. And our last story tonight is about just more legends about Dr. Faust, but in a country that, well, he never went to be honest, but is a good example of, as Jürgen notes, sort of the fan fiction that arises around things. The legend of Dr. Faust in Wursten country, also translated by Jürgen Hubert and also from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodle, so you can support by clicking on the link in the pinned comment below, is our last tale tonight. It is strange how the medieval Faust legend made an excursion from its home territory to the center of Germany, to the utmost northern coastal rim of our German fatherland, to Wursten country. In its essential, the Faust legend of Wursten is this. Dr. Faust made a pact with the devil and signed his poor soul over to him. In exchange, in addition to a lot of money and many possessions, he also negotiated that he should receive the most beautiful, juiciest, I guarantee no one knows what comes next in this sentence, cherries, in vast quantities during every season, in the winter just as much as in the summer. Would you sell your soul for cherries? I mean, I like cherries, but furthermore, whenever he ventured out of the house, there should be a solidly paved road before and just below his wagon, but this road should dissolve immediately after him, so that the same road should not present itself in the earlier, uneven conditions for other humans. Metaphorically, that's a really interesting detail. The devil then fulfilled these and other conditions faithfully and finally fetched Dr. Faust into hell. The house in which this last process allegedly occurred is still shown today. It is part of a farming estate within the parish of Kappel at the Oberstricht. The legend further adds that there is a chamber within this house where the devil roared out of the outer wall with Dr. Faust. And on the inside of this wall, the blood of the man is still visible. And no matter how often this wall is painted over, the blood still seeps through the whitewash and becomes visible. Tammy says, the sky is black, it's pouring, hailing, raining, lightning, it's only 40 degrees. What happened to spring? Climate change. Jumpstore says, grunted like a sow, so specifically grunted like a female pig. Was the grunt not masculine sounding enough? Just say pig, man, you're making me overthink this. That might be more a consequence of the people who collected and translated this were very much of an era. This occurred in an era where using less common, more archaic forms of words was kind of the cultural thing to do. So maybe that's what they're trying to do. Pig was too common. Zombie Wolf says, random trivia, only 3 Roman emperors ever went to Sicily. Caligula, my favorite Roman emperor, Hadrian, and Septimus Severus. Do you like Caligula because of the stories about him, or because you think the stories about him were just part of a smear campaign? What side of the historical interpretation were you on with that? I don't have a favorite emperor, I should say. I just don't care about emperors. Speaking of which, and not caring about emperors, I feel like Pumphut should make a comeback. I feel like we should have like strikes with Pumphut on the sign. Uncle Kitty says, with a little luck, my PC is fixed. I'm glad to hear that. I know you were having some trouble. Tammy says, smear campaign. Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, it seems likely. I don't believe. I'm sort of the view that, well, history's sort of social frameworks are impossible to fully decipher because you exist in one. This is sort of Foucault's point about history. You will inevitably be trying to translate a completely distinct set of cultural structures and ideas into your own to make sense of them. And I do agree with that. But I also don't believe that humans are so radically different from epoch to epoch that the way they would have treated the Roman emperor they didn't like and the way we treat a politician we're trying to defeat now is really going to be all that different. And so I think it's probably a lot of what we know is either overly fawning praise of people trying to support the rule of an emperor or overly critical made-up stories to try and undermine an emperor. But at the end of the day, good riddance to emperors. Tammy says, good, wonderful job tonight. Thank you, Tammy. Had a great time. Hope everyone is having a wonderful evening and sweet dreams all. Zombie Wolf says, Caligula's contemporaries never wrote any of these things about him. Yeah, and that could also be, you know, that could just be they were afraid of him. Like, you know, who knows? Who knows? We'll never really know. So much of history, I realize this is a biased take, but I'm of the view that so much of history is basically folklore. As real as the Fae, you know. Lots of stories about Alexander the Great doing great conquering of the world. But did he? Did he really? Uncle Kitty says it's a lot less murdery though, Rory. Yeah. Anyways, before I get off on a tangent here, I will say thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in and watching. Of course, you don't have to, and I'm glad you do. I hope everyone enjoyed it. But I enjoyed these tales. I enjoy these really specific tales. I really enjoy the legend of Pumphut. I wish you guys should look up some of the pictures of him. He has sort of even though he seems to have a pointed hat in these stories, his more popular conception is that he has kind of a tall stovetop style hat, big red shirt. He's similar to the art that I put on the tag at the beginning of this video, the icon. But that's not a picture of Pumphut. There is no picture of Pumphut I could legally use for copyright reasons. That's a drawing from an old storybook. Zombie Wolf says, "Night guys, I love the story tonight, and I loved having all you folks here watching. Good night, GS and Hammy and Zombie Wolf and Uncle Kitty and Jum Store, and of course, if you're out there, I hope you're having a better week, Witchery, and I hope work is treating you well, Genera. And as for me, I'll see you on Thursday, where I'll figure out something to do to celebrate doing this weird thing for 3 years. Thank you very much, everybody who's been watching, and I'll keep the fire warm. You have a good sleep."